Welcome to chapter 4 of Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So just to give you a little recap, we left the book at the end of chapter 3. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease, where we saw Mr. Utterson going for a dinner party at Dr. Jekyll's house. And as the chapter title suggests, initially Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease, he was quite calm. And then when Mr. Utterson contrived to stay behind to talk to Jekyll, things changed a little bit when Utterson starts talking about the will, and then he starts talking about Mr. Hyde. And he starts really showing his concern towards Jekyll of the situation that he thinks that he may be in. We know that his intentions are good, that he wants to help Dr. Jekyll, but Dr. Jekyll is not very forthcoming in taking that help. And if you remember, his handsome face became black. There became a blackness about his eyes when Mr. Utterson started talking about Mr. Hyde and the clauses of the will. And the one thing that he did reassure Mr. Utterson at the end of the chapter was that any time that he wanted to, he could be rid of Mr. Hyde. So there's almost a certain sense of arrogance and complacency that he is very much in control of Mr. Hyde. But as I said in the last chapter, we find out later in the book that Dr. Jekyll's complacency is actually misplaced, because we discovered that actually Edward Hyde becomes stronger and stronger, and Dr. Jekyll doesn't actually have the strength or the power to control Edward Hyde at all. So we move into chapter 4 then, and again it's another relatively short chapter, as most of them are really in the book. And the chapter title is The Carew Murder Case. Now, as we've seen with every other chapter, the title is really quite significant. And in this case, we have a new character, this Carew, whoever he may be. So it's not a name that we've heard before, which would pique the interest of the reader because we wonder who this person is. And the fact that the chapter is titled The Carew Murder Case suggests that we're going to have a murder. So we can see that the novel is starting to take quite a dark turn at this particular point. Nearly a year later, in the month of October 1800 blank, London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity and rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. So it begins. The chapter begins a year later, so we're not quite sure what's happened in that intervening time. We do find out little bits in the very final chapter of the book, in chapter 10, which is where Dr. Jekyll has his own say and explains to the reader exactly what's happened and to Utterson what's happened to him. But we've got a year where nothing notable seems to have happened. It's interesting that Stevenson he states the month of October, and then it says 18, and there's a blank, 18 blank. Now, we know that the book was written in the 1880s, in the late end of Victorian period. Perhaps the reason why Stevenson doesn't name a particular year is in order to increase the sense of fear and mystery for the reader of the time, who would... if perhaps Stevenson had put a specific year and the reader was reading this book in any years after it, they might not be quite as fearful, because they will perhaps think, oh, that this event has already happened. Whereas by putting a blank next to it, and Stevenson not specifying the year, it increases the mystery. Don't forget, the Victorian reader would not be very familiar with this sort of genre of writing. Gothic literature was on the increase, but even so, people were not exposed to the sort of level of horror and mystery that we are today as a modern reader or as a modern viewer. You've only got to turn on the TV today and you will see murder mysteries and horror films and all sorts of things that we as a reader and as a viewer are much more familiar with. The readers at this time were far less familiar with it, therefore they would be very fearful of this sorts of things, especially as we've talked about the context, in that there was a real fear in the increase of medicine and scientific discoveries, and in particular in the way that they threatened God's position and God's status. As I said, the Victorians were a very religious group of people. So this element here, where Stevenson doesn't put the specific year, is used to perhaps increase the level of mystery for the reader. So it talks about this crime of singular ferocity. Singular ferocity means that it's a particularly ferocious and unpleasant crime that takes place. And it says that it's rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. In other words, it was notable, so it was particularly noted this crime because of the high position of the victim. In other words, the victim of this crime, whatever it is, and we assume that it's going to be a murder from the title of the chapter, that the victim is somebody of high position. Now, we're going back to a time in the Victorian era where your status was quite a determiner in terms of how people viewed you. If you were of sort of middle classes or of the upper classes, any crimes against you will be taken far more seriously. Now, as a generation now, the class system is still in place in the country for us today, but we don't really automatically respect people just because we think that they're of a higher class than us, because we are much more of a diverse society these days. But certainly the fact that Stevenson begins the chapter by saying that the victim of whatever crime, possibly a murder, is of a higher class, it seems to implying here that the crime is worse for that reason. A maidservant living alone in a house not far from the river had gone upstairs to bed at about 11. Although a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, the early part of the night was cloudless, and the lane which the maid's window overlooked, was brilliantly lit by the full moon. It seems that she was romantically given, for she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing. Now, it's interesting to note here that this maid who witnessed the crime that took place is probably the first and one of the very few females that we see in the whole of the book. So that's worth keeping in mind, the fact that it's very much a male-dominated book. All of the central characters are male. Jekyll, Hyde, Utterson, Enfield, Lanyon, all of them are male. And the maid here that witnesses this murder is described as being romantically given. So it suggests that she's perhaps a bit of a daydreamer. She's perhaps somebody who's a little bit weak, I think is the suggestion maybe that Stevenson is making here. And the fact that the narrative continues in the third person. However, it seems almost as though the details that we have in this chapter are a statement that perhaps the maid might have been to the police. So we have 11 o'clock at night, which sets it once again in the darkness, which is where we have this element of mystery, and often where a lot of crimes were committed at night time. It talks about fog that rolled over the city. London at the time was particularly noted for the very heavy fog and smog that surrounded the city, primarily because of the pollution from the Industrial Revolution. And that once again gives it shrouds the city in this air of sort of mystery and darkness. So we have this cloudless night with a brilliant moon. So she sits underneath the window and she kind of falls into a sleep. And it's from the window that she witnesses the crime that she describes. Never, she used to say with streaming tears when she narrated that experience, never had she felt more at peace with all men or thought more kindly of the world. And as she so sat, she became aware of an aged and beautiful gentleman with white hair drawing near along the lane, and advancing to meet him, another and very small gentleman, to whom at first she paid less attention. So the gentleman that she describes at first, when she talks about that she sees from her window, she discusses this aged and beautiful gentleman with white hair. This is in fact a man called Danvers Carew, Sir Danvers Carew, and he is the victim of the murder that's about to take place. And look at the description of him. He's described as being aged and beautiful with white hair. Now, the fact that he's aged and he has white hair, both of these suggest that he's a man of mature years, and that makes him probably, as a victim, it makes it doubly worse because he's a man of older years that perhaps wouldn't be able to defend himself against somebody much younger than him, especially in the brutality of the crime that we see. If you are particularly astute as a reader, you might pick up on the fact that the second gentleman that he comes across in the lane is described as a very small gentleman. And the only other person that we've described of in the novel so far as being small and dwarfish, if you remember, is Mr. Hyde. So a very clever, astute reader might pick up on the fact that this is perhaps Hyde that he encounters in this road. When they'd come within speech, which was just under the maid's eyes, the older man bowed and accosted the other with a very pretty manner of politeness. It did not seem as if the subject of his address were of great importance. Indeed, from his pointing, it sometimes appeared as if he were only inquiring his way. But the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and the girl was pleased to watch it, It seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition, yet was something high too, as if of a well-founded self-content. So the first thing that the maid has kind of related to someone, perhaps the police, is the fact that the two gentlemen encounter each other, and there is perhaps a conversation that takes place underneath the window. She talks about a very pretty manner of politeness, so everything seems quite fine at first. It talks about the subject of his address, in other words, that this mystery man, who turns out to be Hyde. It said that from his pointing, it sometimes appeared as if he were only inquiring his way. So it suggests that the conversation the two have could be about somebody asking directions. But there seems to be no point of concern at all, because the maid said that she was pleased to watch it. And the old gentleman seemed to breathe such an innocent and old world kindness of disposition. So it suggests that the man that goes on to be the victim, Sir Danvers Carew, is a man who gives absolutely no reason whatsoever for the attack that's about to take place. So it suggests that this attack is completely unprovoked, without reason. Presently her eye wandered to the other man, and she was surprised to recognise in him a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master, and for whom she had conceived a dislike. He had in his hand a heavy cane, with which he was trifling, but he answered never a word, and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. So we have once again this gentleman that it's the third or fourth time now that he's been mentioned in the book, and certainly in terms of somebody looking at him, and their very first impression of him is one of negativity, because it says that she conceived a dislike. So right from first looking at him, she's developed within her a dislike for this gentleman, but she can't quite say why. She says that he had in his hand a heavy cane. Now, a cane would be a walking stick, and it says that he was trifling with it. If you trifle with something, it just means that you're meddling with, you're fiddling with it. And it says that he never answered a word and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. And that suggests that as she was watching him, he wasn't speaking, but there was perhaps an impatience that he wasn't able to contain. So he wasn't able to hide that he was growing impatient with this elderly gentleman who was talking to him. And then all of a sudden he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back, with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt. And at that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. And next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered, and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. Now, that's a very significant paragraph there, especially the description that is used of the attack on Sir Danvers Carew. It seems as though it's completely unprovoked and comes very much out of the blue, because the elderly gentleman is described as having an air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt. This is just as the attack takes place, not afterwards. Look at the language that's used. It says that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds, clubbed him to the earth. It talks about ape-like fury, trampling his victim underfoot, hailing down a storm of blows. The bones were audibly shattered. The body jumped upon the roadway. So this is a very, very violent and very unpleasant attack. It's perhaps worth noting here that given that the maid at the start of this chapter had recounted that she couldn't hear the conversation that took place, she apparently here says that the bones were audibly shattered. Now, whether that suggests that the bones were broken so viciously and so loudly that she was able to hear it where she couldn't hear speech, or whether it suggests that maybe her account of the attack is a little bit unconvincing, or perhaps a bit unbelievable, we're not quite sure. But certainly it suggests that she was somebody that was romantically given, so perhaps she was a little bit dramatic as well. So maybe this account of the bones being audibly shattered is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration on her part. So the maid faints, and that's important because it means that the attacker, Mr. Hyde, is able to get away. It's also important to note that the maid recognised Mr. Hyde as having been to see her own master once, which suggests that she is able to identify him to the police. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when she came to herself and called for the police. The murderer was gone long ago, but there lay his victim in the middle of the lane, incredibly mangled. The stick with which the deed had been done, although it was of some rare and very tough and heavy wood, had broken in the middle under the stress of this insensate cruelty, and one splintered half had rolled in the neighbouring gutter. The other, without doubt, had been carried away by the murderer. A purse and a gold watch were found upon the victim, but no cards or papers except a sealed and stamped envelope which he had been probably carrying to the post, and which bore the name and address of Mr. Utterson. The maid comes to. She calls for the police, and it's made very, very clear in this chapter, in this paragraph, sorry, that Sir Danvers Carew is dead. It talks about the body. It talks about the victim laying in the middle of the lane, incredibly mangled, and that's a very, very graphic word to use to describe the body. This is a very, very vicious attack that's taken place. It talks about the stick, the cane that was used to attack him with. And even though it's described as very tough and heavy wood, it's actually broken in the middle, which suggests that this attack was incredibly vicious. It also names the person as being a murderer. And it's interesting because it states that a purse and a gold watch were found upon the victim. So this clearly was not an attack that took place for the purposes of a robbery. So it wasn't a mugging that took place. And then interestingly, the only other thing that's found on the victim is an envelope with the name and address of Mr. Utterson on it, which means that Mr. Utterson, our sort of detective, is brought into the story once again, which means that he, once more, is being given a level of information that allows him to start putting together parts of the story. This letter was brought to the lawyer the next morning, before he was out of bed, and he had no sooner seen it and been told the circumstances than he shot out a sullen lip. "I shall say nothing till I have seen the body," said he. "This may be very serious. Have the kindness to wait while I dress." And with the same grave countenance, he hurried through his breakfast and drove to the police station, whither the body had been carried. As soon as he came into the cell, he nodded. "Yes," said he, "I recognise him. I am sorry to say that this is Sir Danvers Carew." "Good God, sir!" exclaimed the police officer. "Is it possible?" And the next moment his eye lighted up with professional ambition. "This will make a deal of noise," he said, "and perhaps you can help us to the man." And he briefly narrated what the maid had seen and showed the broken stick. So once again, we see that Utterson is drawn into it because it's he that goes to identify the victim of this crime, of the murder, and it's him that recognises him and identifies the body to be that of Sir Danvers Carew. The fact that he's a sir suggests that this is a man of quite notable high status, which would make the murder far more high profile. Had Hyde murdered perhaps somebody from the working classes, there certainly wouldn't be very much of a stink that would be made about it. There wouldn't be very much of an issue made about it. But the fact that in Victorian England we have the victim as being Sir Danvers Carew, who turns out to be an MP, a Member of Parliament, means that the police will probably take this crime far more seriously. And as we can see, the officer who's in charge of the case when Utterson identifies the body, it states that his eye lighted up with professional ambition. In other words, he sees an opportunity to be able to perhaps get himself a promotion if he's able to solve the crime here. Mr. Utterson had already quailed at the name of Hyde, but when the stick was laid before him, he could doubt no longer. Broken and battered as it was, he recognised it for one that he had himself presented many years before to Henry Jekyll. So the stick, then, the cane that is used to murder Sir Danvers Carew, is one that Utterson recognises he himself gave to Dr. Jekyll, which means that Dr. Jekyll has been very clearly linked to Edward Hyde. Now, we obviously know, given that we understand that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person, we know that the stick that he's carrying is his own. It was one that Utterson himself gave to him. But of course, nobody else knows that at this point, certainly not Utterson. So he's just, I mean, as his friend, given that he was the person that gave him this cane as a present many years ago, he will probably be understandably quite upset that the cane had now gone into the hands of Edward Hyde, who yet then in turn had used it as a murder weapon. "Is this Mr. Hyde a person of small stature?" he inquired. Stature means height. "Particularly small and particularly wicked looking is what the maid calls him," said the officer. Mr. Utterson reflected, and then raising his head, "If you will come with me in my cab," he said, "I think I can take you to his house." Now, when he talks about a cab, we're of course talking about Victorian England. Cars hadn't yet been invented. It's what we now know today as what's called a hansom cab. These would be small horse-drawn carriages that people would hail in the same way that they would hail taxis today. It was about this time, about 9 o'clock in the morning, and the first fog of the season. A great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and rooting these embattled vapours, so that as the cab crawled from street to street, Mr. Utterson beheld a marvellous number of degrees and hues of twilight. For here it would be dark like the back end of evening, and there would be a glow of a rich lurid brown, like the light of some strange conflagration, and here for a moment the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling wreaths. Now there's quite an important moment there where he's talking about the sky and about the clouds. The whole thing seems very murky and very dark. So even though it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and they are on the way to the house in Soho, where Mr. Utterson knows that Mr. Hyde lives. If you remember, he gave him the address in chapter 2. The whole thing seems very dark and very, very dingy, even though it's daytime. It could also be looked at as a metaphor for Utterson's knowledge at this point in the novel, because at points it says that it's quite dark and quite lurid brown, and then at other points it talks about a haggard shaft of daylight will glance in between the swirling wreaths. So perhaps that's a metaphor for his knowledge, in the sense that it seems quite dark, and it seems quite mysterious, and he's unable to see properly, but other moments he has clear moments of daylight, only very briefly, and this is perhaps where he starts piecing together the information that he's got in order to solve the mystery. The dismal quarter of Soho, seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps, which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful reinvasion of darkness, seemed in the lawyer's eyes like a district of some city in a nightmare. The thoughts of his mind, beside, were of the gloomiest dye, and when he glanced at the companion of his drive, he was conscious of some touch of that terror of the law and the law's officers which may at times assail the most honest. So they're heading into Soho now. Soho, in an area of London, is at this time in the Victorian era would be really quite notorious. It had really quite a bad reputation. It would be where the more unsavoury people would live, where the prostitutes would be, where a lot of the gin dens, the gin palaces would be. It would be associated probably with working class people, and certainly with some very unpleasant sort of goings on, where perhaps the sinful elements of Victorian England took place. And so it's quite fitting that this is the address that Hyde gave Utterson as to where he lives. And if you notice how Utterson describes it, it talks about like a district of some city in a nightmare. It talks about a mournful reinvasion of darkness. And yet we're reminded of Utterson's goodness when it says that when he glances at his companion on the drive in the journey there, in other words, the police officer, he is conscious of some touch of the terror of the law. In other words, as a good, honest, God-fearing person who doesn't break the law, he's quite conscious of having a police officer sitting next to him. And even today, I think, certainly if I'm driving in my car and a police car is driving somewhere near me, I suddenly think, oh, am I breaking the law? What have I done wrong? Am I speeding? Have I not indicated? And I think that as honest people, we tend to be fearful of the police, even though we've done nothing wrong. So what that does there, it just reminds us of just what a good, honest, morally upright person Mr. Utterson is. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house, a shop for the retail of penny numbers and twopenny salads, many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of many different nationalities passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass. And the next moment, the fog settled down again upon that part, as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. This was the home of Henry Jekyll's favourite, of a man who was heir to £250,000 sterling. Now it's worth noting there the description of Soho as they near where Edward Hyde lives. As I've already mentioned to you, it talks about some of the unsavoury places. It talks about ragged children. It talks about women of different nationalities passing out to have a morning glass, and that'll be a glass of alcohol. So we've got people here that are daytime drinking. For a woman to be drinking anywhere was bad enough, but certainly in the daytime would be very, very taboo. And Utterson reminds the reader there of the fact that Henry Jekyll's will states that Hyde is the sole benefactor to and is heir to £250,000 sterling. Now, £250,000 these days is a lot of money, but going back over 140 years ago, it would be an inordinate amount of money. And it reminds us once again that perhaps Jekyll may not be particularly safe, given the contents of the will. An ivory-faced and silvery-haired old woman opened the door. She had an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy, but her manners were excellent. Yes, she said, this was Mr. Hyde's, but he was not at home. He had been in that night very late. He'd gone away again in less than an hour. There was nothing strange in that. His habits were very irregular, and he was often absent. For instance, it was nearly 2 months since she'd seen him till yesterday. Now, that doesn't seem particularly important, the fact that the landlady of the house where Hyde lives in Soho hasn't seen him for nearly 2 months until yesterday. But if we start piecing it together, it suggests that for 2 months, Jekyll had not turned into Mr. Hyde. So it suggests that maybe he was true to his word and he was trying to perhaps stay away from turning into Hyde a little bit more. We also find out later on in chapter 10 that the longer he stopped himself from turning into Hyde, the more that Hyde grew and grew within his mind. And he describes himself in chapter 10 as, he describes Edward Hyde's presence in his mind as being like a caged animal. And he started to grow more and more aggressive and more wild. So when he did come out for the first time in 2 months, so when he did allow himself to take the potion and become Hyde, Hyde's behaviour is incredibly wild. And it's that we find out later that led to the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, because he was almost like a pent-up animal that had finally been let out after 2 months. Very well, then, we wish to see his rooms, said the lawyer. And when the woman began to declare it was impossible, I'd better tell you who this person is, he added. This is Inspector Newcomer of Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard is the name of the police headquarters in London. So don't get put off by the fact it's called Scotland, because it's right in the centre of London. I'm not quite sure where it's got its name from, but there must be some kind of history to it. A flash of odious joy appeared upon the woman's face. "Ha!" said she. "He is in trouble. What has he done?" Mr. Utterson and the inspector exchanged glances. "He don't seem a very popular character," observed the latter. "And now, my good woman, just let me and this gentleman have a look about us." Now, the fact that his landlady has a look of odious joy on her face when she learns that it's a police officer that's come to look round Hyde's rooms suggests, as the police officer himself acknowledges, that Hyde is not a very popular person. So this woman is clearly quite unscrupulous in the fact that she doesn't like Hyde, and yet she's prepared to take his money for him to live there. Mr. Utterson, in the whole extent of the house, which but for the old woman remained otherwise empty, Mr. Hyde had only used a couple of rooms, but these were furnished with luxury and good taste. Now, this is quite an unusual description that comes up, because given that the surroundings of Soho have been described in very, very negative ways, very dark and unpleasant and savoury, the description that comes up of the rooms that Edward Hyde has decorated are in complete juxtaposition to that. And of course, we acknowledge that that is probably because it's actually Dr. Jekyll's taste rather than Edward Hyde's taste. A closet was filled with wine. The plate was of silver, the napery elegant. A good picture hung upon the walls, a gift, as Utterson supposed, from Henry Jekyll, who was much of a connoisseur. And the carpets were of many plies and agreeable in colour. At this moment, however, the rooms bore every mark of having been recently and hurriedly ransacked. Now, ransacked, if something's ransacked, it means it's been gone through hurriedly. Normally, you describe a room as being ransacked if you've been burgled, so it suggests that everything has been pulled out very quickly and left in a mess. Clothes lay about the floor, with their pockets inside out. Lockfast drawers stood open, and on the hearth there lay a pile of grey ashes, as though many papers had been burned. From these embers the inspector disinterred the butt end of a green cheque-book, which had resisted the action of the fire. The other half of the stick was found behind the door, and as this clinched his suspicions, the officer declared himself delighted. A visit to the bank, where several £1,000s were found to be lying in the murderer's credit, completed his gratification. So in amongst the room then we see that clothes have been pulled out, that drawers lay open, and something has been burned in the fireplace, and it talks about papers that have been burned, and it also talks about the butt end of a chequebook. Now, if you've never seen a chequebook, when you write a cheque, you sort of pull it out and you're left with a little stub where you're able to write in what the cheque was paid for and the amount that it was written out for. And so we've actually found the butt end of a green chequebook that's been burnt in there. And they also find behind the door the other half of the stick that was the murder weapon. So of course finding the other half of the stick clinches the fact that this was very clearly Edward Hyde that committed the murder of Sir Danvers Carew. Now, we find out later on that the reason why Edward Hyde, or it may have been in the person of Dr. Jekyll, the reason why he burnt the checkbook was so that he can never allow himself to become Edward Hyde again. Just to give you the reason why that would be, if you're not aware, up until the 1950s, or maybe it was, I think it might have been the early 1960s in this country, if you were found guilty of murder, the punishment for it would be death by hanging. So given that this is a very high profile victim, this is an MP, he's an elderly gentleman, it's a completely unprovoked and very vicious attack. Were the murderer to be caught, he would be executed, he'd be hanged. And so we find out later on that the main reason why he burns the checkbook is so that Jekyll, when he's in the personality of Jekyll, it means that he can never ever turn back into Edward Hyde again. He's got no temptation, he's got no means of living as Edward Hyde, and he doesn't want any means of living as Edward Hyde again, because he knows that were he to be caught, then he would be executed. And as I said, the fact that this is a very high profile victim means that there will be a very serious manhunt involved from the London police in order to find the killer. "You may depend upon it, sir," he told Mr. Utterson. "I have him in my hand. He must have lost his head, or he never would have left the stick, or above all, burnt the checkbook. Why, money's life to the man. We have nothing to do but wait for him at the bank and get out the handbills." So the police officer from Scotland Yard, his belief is that if they go to the bank and wait there for Mr. Hyde to turn up, they'll catch him, because they expect that he'll perhaps go to the bank, clear it of the thousands of pounds that are in there, and then go on the run. So they feel that this is the ideal way to catch Mr. Hyde. Don't forget, they wouldn't have had cash machines back in these days, so the only way to get money out of your bank in order for him to survive will be to go into his own bank and draw out the money from there. You couldn't just go into any other bank and take money out as we can do these days. You would have to go into the bank that held your account. He talks about getting at the handbills. Now, handbills would be small posters that people would give out on the streets as wanted posters. They didn't have, obviously, any of the social media that we have today. There would be newspapers, but a lot of people either wouldn't be able to afford them or they wouldn't be able to read. So the best way for them to actually catch a very high-profile murderer like this would be for police officers or other people that are paid to do so to stand on the streets and give out posters with pictures of the wanted man on it. This last, however, was not so easy an accomplishment, for Mr. Hyde had numbered few familiars. Even the master of the servant maid had only seen him twice. His family could nowhere be traced. He'd never been photographed, and the few who could describe him differed widely, as common observers will. So it talks about the handbill here, and it's saying, Stevenson in the narrative here is saying that it would be, they realised it was quite difficult because hardly anybody knows him. It describes him as he numbered few familiars, and that means that he wasn't really friends with anybody. That even the people that had met him couldn't really describe him very well, that there was no family that could be traced, that he'd never been photographed. Photographs were in existence during this late Victorian time, and so they would either have had a photograph to use on the handbill, or perhaps they would use an artist's description the way that we might do today. So perhaps they would sketch him out based on the description by the maid that saw the murder. However, as we've seen for 4 times now during the novel, nobody that sees him is actually able to fully describe his face. So this is where they come into a bit of an issue, because they're not actually able to get a picture of Hyde or have a description good enough to be able to draw a picture of him to put on the handbill. Only on one point were they agreed, and that was the haunting sense of unexpressed deformity with which the fugitive impressed his beholders. The fugitive just means the criminal here, and impressed on his beholders means that the people that saw him. So as they confirm here right at the end of the chapter, the one thing that everybody agrees on is this haunting sense of unexpressed deformity. In other words, there is something unpleasant or malformed or deformed about his face that nobody is fully able to explain or describe. So that's the end of chapter 4 then, and we can see here that things have become really quite serious, that there's been a lull of about a year in terms of the events that take place And they've moved up a notch. The first crime that we saw take place was the trampling of the little girl. However, she wasn't killed. She was only really shaken up, and compensation was taken. And once again, here we see another crime, but this is of a far more serious nature. But if you look at the victims, we had the first victim was a little girl. So we had a child who was female, and now we have an elderly gentleman of good reputation. So we could almost assume that perhaps Edward Hyde is choosing his victims as people as being weaker than him, people that perhaps he knows won't fight back. And in some ways, that makes him very much a cowardly figure. But either way, we can see that that the crime is such now that this is not just something that Utterson can keep to himself. This is something that has gone beyond his control now, and perhaps he will probably be unable to keep Jekyll's reputation intact, given that there is clearly some kind of link between the two of them in the eyes of Utterson and now the police. Okay.